Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Irish Studies seminar. So I think as everyone knows by this stage, our events are hybrid, so we have an audience online through Teams as well as here in the room. Thank you all for coming, whichever mode you're joining us through. So it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Queen's an old friend of mine and someone who knows Queen's well, having been here on a number of occasions over the years to talk about his research, Dr. Andrew Newby. So Andy, if you don't mind me calling you that, or informally, is currently Senior Lecturer in the Department of History and Ethnology at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, having previously held research posts at the universities of Helsinki and Tampere in Finland, and also at Aarhus University in Denmark, and history lecturing posts prior to that in Scotland, at Edinburgh and St Andrews.
No, as a student, I was at Aberdeen.
Right. So Andy works across the comparative and transnational histories of the Nordic countries, and the relations to other parts in the world, exploring themes including famine, especially the Great Finnish Famine of the 1860s and its commemoration, poor relief, comparisons with other catastrophes, particularly the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, and the phenomenon of international aid, both from donor and recipient perspectives. And more generally, he's been working on a wider project examining comparisons and contrasts in Irish and Finnish histories. He was one of the joint editors of a special issue of Irish Historical Studies in 2017, exploring comparisons and connections between Ireland and Finland. And he's the author of a monograph, Ireland, Radicalism and the Scottish Highlands, 1870 to 1912, and has another monograph about to appear very soon, sometime in the spring.
It's ready to go. I don't know what I can say in public, but yeah, it's for sale already. I've not had the proofs, but it's for sale. Yeah.
And this is on the Great Finnish Famine of 1867-68 and its remembrance. So we're looking forward to seeing that in print. But Andy's going to talk to us today about one episode in the comparative history of Ireland and Finland. And the subject is It Would Lead to Sheer Anarchy, Joseph R. Fisher, Finland, and the Home Rule Question, circa 1899 to 1914. So, Andy.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. And it is lovely to be back. I know everybody says that. There we go. I was here last time I was here in this part of Northern Ireland, or in Belfast, was on the 31st of January and 1st of February 2020, which was Brexit Day. So I woke up outside of the European Union. I was only here for a gig at the Empire. It was a total coincidence. And then also I remember during that trip, I was having lunch and my wife sent me a message which involved an emoji of a little virus, you know, the green spiky virus, because she'd heard rumors of this virus that was coming appearing in various parts of the world. So I've not managed to be here since then, but I'm of course very happy to be back. And I think actually this picture also reminds me a bit of you, Peter, because I think we once met here during a conference we'd arranged in Helsinki, and we'd arranged to meet as a group there by the statue of the Tsar. And when we got there was about 2,000 people listening to a Sibelius concert on the steps. But it was I'm not usually into this kind of cultural nationalism in Finland, but I remember feeling quite moved by this event. But it was around about Independence Day, wasn't it? Yeah. So, but the talk tonight, I'm going to spend about half the time, I suppose, setting out this analogy which nationalists used between Ireland and Finland in the 19th century and into the start of the 20th century, and then I'll talk about why that was problematic a little bit, and then kind of undermine it all by explaining a bit about the work of Joseph Fisher. I don't have it's not a work in progress so much as a work that's always been in the back of my mind. So I'm not necessarily doing anything with this. I'm not writing an article or anything at the moment, but maybe. This is Joseph Fisher. He was born in Rafferty, below in County Down. He studied at Inst and then at Queen's College, Galway, not Dublin, as not actually Belfast, as it claims in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, but He graduated in 1876, and he worked as a barrister and a journalist. For example, he was editor of the Northern Whig between 1900 and 1913. He was the author of a very significant book in 1899 called Finland and the Tsars, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And in the context of the north of Ireland and then Northern Ireland, he was on the Ulster Unionist Council. He wrote a book in 1911 called The End of the Irish Parliament. He was a prominent member of the Boundary Commission, and in the end, he retired to London, died in London in 1939. But I'll speak more about him in the second half of the talk. The Finland and the Tsars book was very influential because it was a book about Finnish history in English, which was then used by Finnish nationalists to promote the cause of Ireland outside of the cause of Finland, outside of Finland. And this was a very important stage in Finnish nationalism. They like it, the Finns, when foreigners talk about their history in a way that bolsters their own view of their history, let's say. He also in 1911 wrote the Encyclopedia Britannica article jointly, strangely. I don't know how they managed it. We just discussed earlier with Liam how nice it is to do things together. But Fisher wrote the entry for Finland with Prince Kropotkin and John Scott Kelty. So that was also another contribution to Finland. And this is just a small explanation of his own involvement with Finland, which he wrote to Julio Reuter, who was a Finnish nationalist leader, professor of Sanskrit at the University of Helsinki. And I'll come back to this in the second part of the talk as well, but it just does underline that Fisher had a long-standing interest in Finland and what he calls the country and its welfare. And I know some of you have been to Finland, some of you know very well this context, but just to show you, this is Finland in the 19th century in a European context. Towards the end, I'll show you another slide where it's in its Russian imperial context, but this is Finland, and you can see here that in the 19th century, it's part of the Russian Empire. So it's considered part of the Nordic countries, often said to be part of Scandinavia, let's say, which is also problematic sometimes in terms of language and so on. But for the period 1809 to 1917, it's a part of the Russian Empire. But you can see also that it's a autonomous country. It runs its own internal affairs, and for a large part of the 19th century, Finland develops its organs of what we would have called home rule by essentially not imposing any financial demands on Russia. Russia is quite happy for Finland to be prosperous and to show the Western world that this is what the Russian Empire can be. And paradoxically, in some ways as well, Russia is happy for Finnish nationalism to develop because they believe that it would break any residual loyalty towards Sweden, which had ruled Finland until 1809. So Finnish nationalism does develop under the context of the Russian Empire. From an Irish perspective, there are lots of interesting parallels we can examine. There's this whole question of unions and unionism. Chronologically, the period that Ireland is under is ruled from London is more or less similar to the period that Finland is under Russian rule. And of course, we have one country or one territory with home rule and one not. So that's an interesting contrast. We also have the famines Peter mentioned earlier. I've worked quite a lot on the Finnish famine, both from a comparative perspective, but also just from the point of view of the fact that nobody's really written much about the Finnish famine, at least compared with Ireland. Issues of language and nationalism, issues of how the territory relates to the empire and military recruitment and so on. The home rule question, which is the main point of today's talk, but then also things like emigration and so on, land agitations. And by the turn of the century, Finland is referred to in many sources as the Ireland of Russia. And that was the title of a book that I wrote a few years ago that came out again as Gaelga. But I'm thinking of doing an English version of this at some point. But basically, the text of Éire na Rúise is available in the article I wrote in the Irish Historical Studies, and also a book I wrote for Roisin Healy and others in a book about 1916 and the 1916 in global context, it was called. So most of this is there, also in English. And then coincidentally, both countries, the Free State and Finland, the Irish Free State, both got, let's say, independence on the 6th of December, but 4 years apart. So again, we have the context of independence and civil war to follow. And I'll talk about, time is running out. Finland started to become part of the imagination of Irish nationalists in, let's say, the 1850s. And that's partly because Finland became better known in an international context because of the Crimean War. It was an important Western front in the Crimean War. This image is of the Battle of Bomersund in 1854. This is only very briefly, and it's not really relevant, but just because we're in Northern Ireland, one of the first recipients of the Victoria Cross was Charles Davis Lucas, because of his actions at Bomersund. So I just thought I'd add that slide in, you know, this like Bon Jovi doing an Undertones song or something like that to please the local audience. That shows how old I am in like 2 ways. I didn't know which order to put these up. Actually, I'll skip this one for now and then come back to it, because in 1854, there's one of the earliest quotations here from The Nation. Many a curious parallel and pregnant lesson may be found in the history and condition of this northern race, as the Finnish Finns in Finland, the Irish of Ireland, the real nation desiring to be Irish and nothing else. So the idea was that the Finns are developing their own sense of national identity through their language, that they are not Swedes, they're not Russians, they're Finns, ethnically, linguistically, and so on. And Thomas Davies and these other nationalists saw something there that could be used for Ireland. On the other side of the equation, there was a report that Finnish was not actually a suitable basis for national culture. It was seen to be a rural, kind of boorish culture by the Swedish-speaking elites in Finland, some of them. Many others, most of the Finnish nationalists were speaking Swedish as their first language, but learned Finnish enthusiastically to show that they were Finnish. But the counter argument was that this was not actually a language of government or you know, something that could be used seriously. And that's partly why it was allowed to develop under Russian rule, because they didn't see it as a viable language for any kind of higher level administration or so on. But I like this article because it was reported in a British context that Finns were becoming Fenians. So that you can see here, suomalainen fenialaisuus. This is because in the English language, Fenianism and phenomenism were sort of similar. So articles were appearing in the English language press equating the two. Whereas Fenianism in the 1860s had a very bad reputation for violence and kind of forceful nationalism. Finnish nationalism was really seeking to develop through conciliation, almost through being ignored by being well behaved. The Finns didn't like to be compared with Poland, for example, the Polish Revolution of the 1863, Bulgaria, and definitely not Ireland. So whereas Irish nationalists are using Finland as a positive comparison, Finnish nationalists look across Europe and see what they consider to be a violent, backward country in the West, which is not a good model for developing. So there's kind of lopsided analogy between the two. Again, I think I'll come back to that later, depending on time. And as we get through to the Home Rule debates in the 1880s, we start to see Finland cropping up with other countries like Norway and so on, and parts of the empire as countries that have had what we would call Home Rule. Another article from The Nation explicitly says this is a Russian example to England. Finland, where the Tsar of Russia is being feted and lionized, resembles Ireland in great measure. It goes through the reasons why Ireland is similar to Finland. And it says that a big difference is that Finland has peasant proprietary. So again, it's connected to the land war, connected to the idea that if large-scale landlordism was got rid of, the people would be much more contented, much more economically productive, actually to the benefit of the empire at that stage. And then as the debates take off, there's a couple here from Thomas Sexton, the MP for South Sligo, argued that the Irish Home Rulers could show that the people of Finland, with their bleak sky and sterile land, are happy and free even under the domination of the Tsar of Russia. And again, Russia itself is honeycombed with conspiracies, but Finland is harmonious and peaceful because the imperial rulers in St. Petersburg have had the wisdom to allow the people of Finland to manage their own affairs. So you can imagine how vilified the Tsar and Russia in general was in Victorian Britain. So this is kind of quite a dig at the British administration to say that even the Russians allow home rule for their people. Why shouldn't we? And then Gladstone himself eventually adds Finland to this kind of suite of examples he has from around the world, which he uses to argue in favour of home rule. Legislative independence has provided complete satisfaction in Finland, and importantly, has increased the loyalty of Finland towards the imperial rulers, so that home rule could strengthen the integrity of the Union rather than lead to a gradual disintegration of the Union. And this all starts to fall apart a bit in the 80s, and then especially in the 1890s, when Russian policy changes and we enter what the Finns know as the periods of oppression, the sortokaudet, from 1899 to 1906, and then 1908 until independence in 1917. These are the two periods of oppression. But it gradually builds up so that the liberties that Finland had enjoyed from 1809 are gradually restricted under a Russia-wide process of so-called Russification, that they want a kind of unified approach amongst all the territories in terms of the administrative structures, in terms of civil servants using the Russian language, in terms of Finland, for example, not being able to opt out of imperial service. So these sort of things start to undermine the idea that Finland is a contented part of the empire. Sorry, I should have moved on the slide. Yep. And during this period, you get concerted efforts by the Fenomans, the Finnish nationalists, to have the case of Finland represented in the foreign press. So they send journalists to be correspondents in London, for example, to make sure that stories about Finland appear in the Times or other British newspapers. We also start to see passive resistance in Finland as a general policy. So not joining the army, for example, is one, strikes and so on, but also to a certain extent, to a very small extent, active resistance. So you see some very high level assassinations, not least that of Governor General Bobrikov in June 1904. Some of you will have read about it in Ulysses. It happens around about lunchtime, while they're in the Freeman's Journal office. The news comes through that Bobrikov has been assassinated. And the reaction in some ways parallels that to the Phoenix Park assassinations. We also get a group called the Verikoirat, which literally means bloodhounds, but it's not like a bloodhound, but some kind of other killer dog, which are gun running. There's a similar event to the Hove gun running and so on. So there are these kind of parallels between Ireland and Finland in that way. But there are different opinions within Finnish nationalism. It's not a monolithic movement or ideal. So because of that, you get different shades of opinion in Ireland using Finland as an example. So in some ways, although Gladstone's idea of home rule is in tatters, the idea that Finland is a model for home rule is somewhat in tatters. We see a continuation, for example, of the idea that Finland is a great example for developing cultural nationalism, either linguistically or through literature, for example, or drama. Finland is also inspiring people like Michael Davitt, who's there when he visited Russia 3 times. He twice went to Finland and was inspired by, in this case, the refusal of Finns to join the Russian army. And he wrote then when he came back to Ireland that this is what the Irish should be doing. So more like a form of passive resistance. Arthur Griffith uses Finland very little, but the idea that he uses Hungary and the developing Sinn Féin movement uses other small countries in Europe, even Denmark, for example, starts to include Finland in this discussion. And then I think on the next slide, I have something from Michael Collins. Oh, no, not yet. But anyway, Michael Collins is more inspired. Let's say the young Michael Collins is inspired by this idea of violent resistance, or more active resistance. And this is just a quotation here from John Hamden Jackson, who was another one of these British advocates of Finland, but a bit later. But I just like this quotation, really, that it's said that Arthur Griffith founded the Free State with an essay on Hungary. He might have founded it more securely with a study of the Finns. And the article, I've also translated an article of Hamden Jackson, which was in that Irish Historical Studies, where he goes through these parallels, and I've made footnotes where he was wrong about stuff. So you're welcome to have a look at that. And then this is Michael Collins. This is when he was living in London, when he was the secretary of the Geraldine GAA Club. And there's a lot of stuff in here. I've also been a secretary of a GAA club, and a lot of the stuff was very familiar to me, that he's writing to the council to beg for winter training pitches and things like this. But amongst this, he's giving a Christmas speech to the Geraldine GAA Club in London, and he uses Finland and Ireland as his example. And he says here, the analogy between Finland and Ireland is almost perfect. He calls the Finns a quiet race who do not specialize in talk. And he, again, uses this comparison with Phoenix Park and the assassination of Bobrikov. We've seen how Finns found it advantageous to ally with the Russian revolutionaries. May we not find it also beneficial to allow ourselves to be helped by the English revolutionists? And here he also uses the idea that Finland has 2 distinct groups of Finnish-speaking and Swedish-speaking Finns, and that they come together against the Russian Empire, and he uses this to inspire his audience that Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants could come together against British governance as well. So he uses lots of ideas of Finland in his speech. He says, I maintain the analogy between Ireland and Finland is almost perfect. Altogether, there are only 2 million of them, and they won against the might of the Empire of Russia. Can we not go and do likewise? En avant. So everybody then cheers and throws their hats in the air. Oh, okay. And then, sorry, that was me. Oh, sorry, I should have. Okay, I have too many animations on my stuff. And just to finish off this, it goes on. So throughout the period of World War I, throughout periods of independence and civil war, Finland and Ireland are used as comparators. The Irish, especially after the third Home Rule Bill fails, but mainly after the second Home Rule Bill, Ireland does actually start to seep more into Finnish discourse, because the Finns loved Gladstone, and they think that if Gladstone thinks this is a good idea, then it probably is a good idea. So they overcome this idea that it's a kind of policy of mad Irish revolutionaries, and that if a statesman of Gladstone's type can support Irish Home Rule, then it's maybe not such a bad thing. And I sometimes, this is from Fan Yan Le, and after the Civil War, which I won't go into, but the Civil War in Finland made the Irish Civil War look like a barroom brawl. Like it was maybe 10 times more people died. I don't like this kind of comparison in terms of mortality, but the fact is that about 10 times more people died in a much shorter period in Finland, between red and white, amongst the same lines as the Russian Revolution. But this article kind of is talking about that. And then I've got another one from the Tuam Herald, which advocates Free State following the example of the Finnish Whites, which was to basically execute people who didn't agree with them. So there's different ways of using Finland as a comparator. Okay, so actually we're more or less on on time at the moment. I'm surprised. I haven't had a chance to talk to people for a long time, so I'm kind of over. So the analogy which is used by various shades of Irish nationalism, but Finland is a good example. It can be that Finland is a contented home rule country. It can be that the Finns were, using passive resistance to an excellent degree, or even that in certain circumstances violent action was justified. All of these things had happened in Finland, so different shades of Irish nationalist opinion were using them. And Finland ends up being known as the Ireland of Russia. Finnish nationalists weren't always convinced of the analogy, but admiration for Gladstone, as I said, started to lead to a gradual warming towards the Irish case. And the article I wrote in the Irish Historical Studies was called "Black Spots on the Map of Europe," and it's from this quotation here, where a Finnish nationalist newspaper, Vapaita Sanoja, or the free words, reprints an article from Le Figaro from 1901, which says Ireland, Poland, Finland, Alsace-Lorraine, how many black spots on the map of Europe? So amongst these other areas, Finland is seeing some sense of comparison. This is a famous picture. I always find it interesting because this is meant to be a subtle allegory, which got through the Russian censorship laws. But I don't know, a two-headed eagle attacking a blonde woman with a book saying "Lex." It's not the most subtle allegory I've ever seen, but still, it's a very famous image. All Finnish school children learn about this, the Russian eagle attacking the Finnish constitution here in 1899. Now, if you think of the times in the Victorian era, maybe the only group of people or nationality that comes up with more abuse than Ireland is Russia. So the Times in its editorials and other British newspapers following this is very supportive of Finland from a perspective of Russophobia in many ways, saying that the Russians aren't to be trusted. The Russians should allow Finland to have home rule. They're cracking down on these liberties of this happy and advanced people, and it shows how backwards Russia is. Finns are also Protestant, Lutherans, which in the 1800s, demonstrates that they're hardworking and improvable and all of these qualities that Protestant people are meant to have. As opposed to the Russian Orthodox religion of the people in Russia. So Irish nationalists think that this is extremely hypocritical, and right so. So lots of Irish nationalist newspapers talk about this idea that the British love Finland, but they're blind to the injustices that are occurring just across the Irish Sea, much closer to home. The Finnish nationalist strategy is based on getting international support. And that's also based on a very strong tendency in Finland towards Anglophilia, not least because Britain is seen as a beacon in Europe in the 19th century of liberalism, as opposed to some other countries, not least Russia. So, as I said earlier, there's a strong effort amongst Finnish nationalists to have stories of injustices towards Finland placed in the British press, so that British politicians, the British public, have a strong sense of sympathy towards Finland. And they also want to distinguish their case between Finland and these wild rebellious peoples like the Irish and the Polish. And I often explain this to my students in Finland as, I also have to explain this sometimes when I give talks, for example, to on behalf of the Irish Embassy in Finland, where we're talking about what great friends Finland and Ireland are, and how we love each other, and we both work for the UN and so on, which is all true, of course. But the fact is, during the 19th century, Ireland wasn't seen as for most of the 19th century, Ireland wasn't seen as a cognate case with Finland. And one of the reasons, a very simple reason, is that almost everything Irish people knew about Finland was reported from the Times. And almost everything Finnish people knew about Ireland was reported in the Times. So there's a very asymmetric understanding between Finland and Ireland mediated through these newspapers, which doesn't allow for direct comparison. And it's only later then in the 1890s and the early 1900s when you start to get actual visits between the two, that you start to get correspondence, or people like Michael Davitt, William Ryan visiting Finland and talking about the situation there. Jeremiah McVeigh as well, who was an MP in Ireland. And you can see here, by the time the periods of oppression start to develop, the conservative opinion or unionist opinion in Britain is kind of used to this charge of hypocrisy and is able to deal with it. And this is an idea that I actually will need to come on to Fisher in a moment, but this is where Fisher starts to be involved as a correspondent for the Times. And you can see in this first quotation here, it wouldn't be a problem if it were a case of a free, civilized, highly cultured and humane power endeavouring to raise an inferior one to its own level. The implication here is that what the British are doing in Ireland, I think, whereas Finland is actually more developed than Russia. So this is one way of putting it. Here's the Times of London in 1892. It deprives, what's going on in Russia at the moment deprives Gladstone and Gladstonians of one of their set examples of how Home Rule works. And then finally, in 1899, under the context of this severe crackdown on Finland's liberties by Russia, Joseph Fisher, I believe, it's not credited to Fisher, but I think this is his writing. He's the correspondent in Europe for Finland for the Times at this time. And he's writing from Vienna, so he's not exactly on the spot, but he says he got a letter from a friend in Finland, and he protests against the comparison recently drawn between the case of Finland and that of Ireland. He does not consider the parallel worth a moment's argument. Whereas all the brains, breeding and money throughout Ireland and the whole north of that country are unionist, there is not a single Finn who wants to be Russified. How could it be otherwise, considering the present state of Russia? Half of the central provinces are dying of starvation, and so on. So again, it's reinforcing this idea that it's a flawed analogy because the Irish are idiotic bog hoppers and the Finns are literate, owner-occupiers of the land in many cases, but certainly not to be compared. And in response as well, there was a very important article written by William Stead in his journal Review of Reviews. William Stead, better known for his work on child prostitution, for example. Also, I suppose, tenuous connection with Belfast. He died on the Titanic. William Stead had written an article in his journal, The Review of Reviews, in 1899, which compared Finland with Ireland and explicitly accused the British administration of hypocrisy in supporting Finland, but not Ireland. And this lovely journal, Finland, an English journal devoted to the cause of the Finnish people, which emerged in 1899 and 1900. I have the originals of these in my office, and I was going to bring them with me, but they would have been turned to papier-mâché by now. But they're very, very lovely bits of work. It's also something else I'll tell my students, because when I was first doing work on this, I had to go to London to the Colindale newspaper library to look at this. And now everything is online, of course, and they can just, you don't know your borders. No, I preferred going to Colindale and going through microfilms and kind of learning more. But anyway, the British elites by 1899 are well rehearsed in rebutting this hypocrisy claim, and this article is a good example of it. And you can probably, it's there that the question is not really worth discussing, and the argument here is that Ireland is asking for something it has never had, whereas Finland is only asking that what it has is not taken away. So this is the difference between the two cases, according to the unionist, let's say, developing unionist opinion. Which brings us on more specifically to Joseph Fisher, very interesting character. And I actually found these they've been used before. I'm not saying I discovered them, but I wasn't aware of them. His letters in the archive in Åbo Academy in the city of Turku in Finland. I was looking for something else. This is also what doesn't happen if you're looking at digitized sources. You don't find other stuff by accident. And I came across these letters between himself and Julio Reuter, the leading figure amongst the Finnish nationalists. And it was very interesting to me that an Ulsterman was writing to Julio Reuter, who was a nationalist, and how did this kind of subvert what we were thinking about, this parallel between Irish nationalism and Finnish nationalism. And this is the first letter, quite a nice postcard actually from Helsingfors, 24th of April 1899. Arrived here yesterday. B is showing me every attention and introducing it. So I'm just showing you some of the sources here, really. But this letter collection goes on for about 20 years between himself and Reuter, and it does talk about Finnish nationalism, about Irish nationalism, and Irish unionism. And it was in 1899 that he published his book Finland and the Tsars. And because of his legal background, when it was published, the book was praised, especially for the way in which it depicted the legal basis for Finland's claims to nationhood on the settlement of 1809, where the Tsar, it's very, very kind of vague pronouncement, but the Tsar said Finland now belongs to the family of nations. And of course, this goes through several translations, and it doesn't quite mean anything, or it does mean a lot. No one really knows, but it's debated. But Joseph Fisher was able to unpick some of this and explain it. The book's about 350 pages long. Again, I was going to bring it with me, but I'm trying to travel as light as possible. And it was suppressed in Russia, which is usually a good sign in this case. And I would argue that in Fisher's mind, I know least about this amongst many of you, but it becomes in some ways a model for Ulster exceptionalism, by which in my mind I mean that you move from the idea that the unionist population in Ireland is spread throughout the island of Ireland, but then eventually you come to a point where you think we'll separate this bit of the island off, and that will be a better way of protecting our rights and our liberties and our values and so on. Finland, in Fisher's mind, can be a model for this. And this is his correspondent, Julio Reuter, excuse me, and a group of men called the Kagal, or Kagalen in Swedish, Kagali in Finnish, obviously. That's Reuter there, and this is at a manor house not far from where I live in southern Finland in 1903. But this group of men, the Kagal, were very influential in setting the agenda for Finland's passive resistance. They had also links to the more active resistance side, but they were the main conduit for putting these pictures of Finland in the international press and presenting Finland's case, writing articles in French or German or English. And Reuter, as a professor of Sanskrit, was very gifted in languages and was able to present Finland's case in lots of different languages. And he befriended Joseph Fisher. It seemed for a while in 1905 that Finland and other parts of the Russian Empire had come through the periods of oppression, and the October Manifesto of 1905 gave, for example, Finland its own elected parliament. One thing people know about Finland is that women, it was one of the first places, or the first place where women were elected to Parliament. They argue this with New Zealand. I try to stay above the fray. And in the aftermath of this, Fisher wrote to Julio Reuter. I only have this for a publication in 1908, but he's talking here about, again, explicitly the comparison between Ireland and Finland, and congratulating Finland on keeping its rights, its social structures, its civil society, but also the way in which it governs itself. And he claims that there are warring parties of the North and South in Ireland. This has been the fault of the Celtic race ever since the days of Tacitus and Julius Caesar, and it still occurs to Ireland. Let Finland be careful not to follow such a miserable example. Ireland has suffered a lot of injustice at the hands of England, as has Finland at the hands of Russia, but nations survive or fall in the end through their own internal qualities. And I find this interesting because it admits English misgovernance, but for me, this is a kind of liberal unionist perspective with the emphasis on liberal almost. There's this kind of, we are coming through this together. Ireland, there's another way forward at this stage in 1905, and it's that Ireland will remain a coherent political unit, but it will remain a part of the United Kingdom. So Ireland has its own national identity and will contribute to the identity of the UK and the Empire. And I think I'm influenced here by having grown up reading Graham Morton's Scottish book called Unionist Nationalism, where Scotland has its own national identity, but is very much part of the overarching structures of Britain and the Empire. Reuter himself writes about Ireland in the Finnish press, and he's particularly taken with Lord Dunraven's devolution scheme, for example, in 1904 or 5, and he's writing here in 6-7. Again, something that I remember reading about the devolution scheme in Lyons, I think, but it's not something that we're talking about too much. I'm a bit away from the everyday discourse of Irish history at the moment, but maybe I need to go back to this a bit and see how it was discussed. But I won't get too bogged down in that. So these are some examples of Fisher's letters to Reuter in the period. This is 1908, and that I'm a sincere believer in autonomy in Finland and a determined opponent of home rule in my own country must have seemed to you somewhat paradoxical. It's sufficient to say that in each case I believed, a supporter of the old things worth living for: freedom, enlightenment, and justice. So you can see here it's very similar to that article we read in the Times, where it would be a different case if Finland was a backward country being improved, but it's not. Practical liberty is simply a means to an end. Home rule for Ireland would mean neither freedom nor enlightenment nor justice. As in Ulster, as for your Swedish-speaking people, a minority but taking the lead socially and industrially, you have your differences with your Fenno men, we have our Celts. So it's from a Finnish point of view, it's interesting here because Fisher is talking to Reuter as a representative of a Swedish-speaking elite, and he's worried that these backwards, like, I'm not saying this for somebody who's in Jyväskylä, which is this sort of centre of Finnish-speaking Finland in the 1860s. But this is the perception at the time. But saying that home rule for Ireland would actually put us in the hands of these unenlightened, backwards people. Here's another example. This is from 1909. I think his handwriting is terrible. I think. And the other thing, this collection is bound really tightly, and I had to kind of put my arm down it and try and take a picture with one hand with the pictures. So it's not very easy to read.
Anyone but you that reluctant?
Huh?
Do you think anyone but you have that?
Yeah, I do. Other people have used them. Yeah, there's a PhD by a guy called Anssi Halmesvirta called "The British Perception of Finnish Race and Nationality" or something like that.
Okay.
I can give you references. And then I noticed another article from a newspaper in the 1970s explaining, I think I refer to it in a moment, but he's explaining the situation to a Finnish audience of the Northern Ireland problem in the 1970s, and quotes Fisher and quotes one of these letters. So that's interesting as well. That's a guy called George Maud, who was a lecturer in Turku, where these letters are. So
Sorry, apologies.
no, sure. And this one I like, and this is where I got the quotation for the title of the talk from. He admits that he speaks here as an avowed partisan, and you'll make due allowance and form your own conclusion. There's always existed in Ireland a strongly rebellious or treasonable element. It has its justification in shocking misgovernance and tyranny in the past. Okay, it admits this as well. Irish liberals, now called Irish liberal unionists, have strongly combated that misgovernment and have for a century advocated the disestablishment of the imported English church, the abolition of alien landlordism by the establishment of an occupying ownership, by advocating county councils. But we've always opposed in principle the separatism or the separate entity on the ground that it would lead to sheer anarchy. to national disruption and to a reactionary and obscurantist priestly tyranny, such as habitually exercised by the Roman Catholic priests in 3/4 of our island, which is under their influence. And he goes on, this is the same source, same letter. We Irish liberals know that the government, this is his underline, we know that the government of Ireland by clerical nationalists who servilely crouch and grovel to their bishops means a government which freeborn men have never submitted to and will never submit to. We've completed arrangements by which we will resist, passively or actively as occasion requires, any attempt to hand us over to the governance of men who live in the Middle Ages or in the times of the Spanish Inquisition. Do you realise that no nationalist newspaper in Ireland dare print a line that was not approved by his bishop? That the Irish Peasant, as in the newspaper, was suppressed, but that no nationalist newspaper dare so much as mention the fact, still less comment upon it. Ireland under Home Rule would be an Ireland by which no man could speak the truth except with the permission of a bishop. So this is how he explains to his Finnish colleagues why, and from a good, it's a very logical position to take, that I'm in favour of Finnish Home Rule, but not Irish Home Rule. Sorry, I'll wrap up. Can I have 5 more minutes? Of course, yeah. So by 1913, thanks especially to Fisher, the parallels between Finland and Ulster as oppressed enlightened liberals were being made ever more explicitly. Presumably both benefited in British public opinion as a result. Was this was this Fisher's intention when he first made an inquiry into Finland's legal constitutional status? I don't know. Or did this parallel just dawn on him as he was writing about Finland? I don't know. I need to do more work maybe with that. And blossomed during the Third Home Rule Bill. But it seems already that he wrote to Reuter in 1909 saying that they were already making plans to resist any kind of imposition. And in Alvin Jackson's book on Home Rule, he writes that Fisher dwelt on strategies for wrecking the Home Rule Bill. So Fisher admits that he's partisan to Reuter, but he is also doing this from a very partial perspective, not from the idea of a neutral journalist, if such a thing exists. And there's a couple more articles here which were inspired by Fisher, written by Fisher, both of which explicitly compare Finland with Ulster, and again go back to this idea that that Finland's protesting against the withdrawal of its autonomous privileges, which Ulster should have under the Union. Both Finns and Ulstermen ask only that no change should be made in the status which they hold and have been constitutionally guaranteed. So it goes on in that way. About 2-3 slides maybe left, but you can see this one as well. At the outbreak of the Great War, both sides know it. There's articles here comparing Russification with Celtification, which kind of develops what I was talking about earlier. Unfortunately, I don't believe this is Fisher, but it's anonymous from a silent voter. And just a small addition here. This is from Helsingin Sanomat, the Finnish newspaper, on 4th of April 1914. Sorry to sound like an old man again, but this is another thing I have to show my students, because if you looked for his book Finland and the Tsars, you wouldn't find this reference because they've mistyped it Finland and the Cars here. So I don't know how you would never never find it. Very innovative book for 1899. But what this story is saying, firstly, it shows you that Finns love it when known visitors come, because that's what this means. It means notable visitor. And saying this author is visiting us, like nice. He's also taking in a full session of the Finnish Parliament, seeing how it works. So I don't know whether he's looking for workable models for a home rule for a home rule parliament in Ulster, under in the event of Ireland getting home rule. But also in another newspaper this week, it also reports him being there and saying he's planning on writing a new book about Finland, which he never actually does do. So anyway, during this period, he is again in Finland. And again, this is just a salad dressing for the talk, but I just find this an interesting illustration. I presume it's taken from an English language journal, but it's reprinted in Finland. explaining that in the 9 counties of Ulster, what's the proportion of Catholics and Protestants. And the headline says, "Civil War threatens Ireland." So this is how the Irish case is being portrayed in Finland in 1914, just before the outbreak of the Great War. And as you know, eventually Fisher becomes a part of the Boundary Commission. Here he is down in Armagh in 1924. And during this period, he writes, for example, he's done a good year's work for Ulster by securing Carson's 6th county, Ulster, and so on. I should also say in 1921, at the Anglo-Finnish Society's Midsummer Party, he was awarded the White Rose Commander 2nd Class, which is one of these awards that Finland, even today, gives out to foreigners who pay attention to them. Well, you think I'm joking, but it's in the article that announced it said it's for Englishmen, I put sick, who have shown a special interest in our land. So this is literally what they say. But the idea that Finland is in the Guardian or whatever today is always reported in the Finnish press. Oh, we were on, yeah. So I don't know who's watching, so I should be careful. And sorry, there's Fisher again. And at the start, I showed you the context of Finland in Europe, and this is Finland in the Russian Empire. So you can see for Finnish nationalists and Irish nationalists. For Irish nationalists, the analogy is that Finland is Ireland and Britain is Russia. For Ulster Unionists, or let's say even say Ulster nationalists, you could say, the analogy is that Ulster is Finland and Russia is Ireland. So that's why this kind of double analogy works. And I think this, in the context of the Russian Empire, when you see Finland, this makes more sense. The Ulster kind of up there in the corner, separate with its own rules, own laws, and that kind of feeds into arguably a partitionist mindset. And now that's my final slide. It's a handsome chap, I think. So Irish, just go through a few of the main headlines, I suppose. Irish Home Rules sought workable international examples, and Finland was one of these. Finland's own path to independence was based on compliance and not being noticed by Russia, so not annoying the Russians. You know, this worked very well for about 70 years because the successive czars were actually happy for Finland to be loyally, you know, getting on with their own lives in the corner of the empire. By the early 1900s, there were enough strands of both Irish and Finnish nationalism to allow some sort of mutual recognition, and especially from external observers, which referred to the Ireland of Russia. Finnish nationalists craved international recognition based on legal right and got strong support from Britain, which led to these charges of hypocrisy often. And Joseph Fisher himself was beguiled by the legal case for Finnish self-determination, and he eventually saw a close parallel with Irish unionism and eagerly argued the liberal unionist case to Julia Reuter and other Finnish nationalists. George Maud, who I just alluded to, sorry, who was writing this article about Northern Ireland, sorry, it was 1966, I said the 70s earlier. He called him Ulster Protestant newspaperman and patriot. And then the journal, British journal in 1940 referred to him as the champion of the rights and liberties of Ulster. So this is, for those people who do remember Joseph Fisher, or for those who've written about him since, these are important parts of his personality. Whereas I just always imagined him as the editor of the Northern Whig. I was kind of unaware of his very strong political interventions until I started looking at him through this Finnish lens. And eventually you start to get Ulster seen as a coherent political unit rather than as the idea of unionist nationalism encompassing unionists all over Ireland. And I don't know the extent to which Finland is lying in Fisher's mind when he's making these arguments for partition and so on. And just to say as well, there are later analogies between the two. So when the League of Nations is formed, for example, the Åland Islands, that's probably anybody who's learned anything about the League of Nations at school remembers this was their only success or something, the Åland Islands. But that was one example that Northern Ireland was used as an example where you can separate off a people and let them have their own devolved rules and laws and language in the case of the Åland Islands. And then this is very frustrating because I've read this and I just can't find the reference. This is bad, being a bad historian, but it was when I was, again, looking for something else and I saw another column in the newspaper. In the 1920s or 1930s, there was an idea that all of the Swedish-speaking Finns in Finland would go off and live in Ostrobothnia in the west, and that it would become like a Finnish version of Northern Ireland. And I'd love to do more on that, but I just don't have, it's only in my head at the moment, so I can't do much more on it, but it is there. Other people have noted the ideas, the analogy between Swedish-speaking Finland and Northern Ireland, like Stein Rockan and Richard Rose, Bill Kissan more recently, in his comparative work on Finland and Ireland. But I think overall it just shows the flexibility of this type of comparative political or constitutional analogy, depending on the current circumstances. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience, and sorry for going over time, and I'll be very happy to try and answer any questions.
Andy, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very insightful. I'm sure there will be some questions. We can take questions from people here in the room or from people joining us online. Just raise your hand digitally if you want to do that. Who would like to start? Yes, Morris.
Thanks very much. I want to ask what your sense is from the sources of where Finland sits in the Irish nationalist imagination in relation to other international comparisons we're using, particularly Eastern Europe. Is it more important than Poland, less important? And just that kind of,
yeah, it's a very good question, and one thing that really, I think it's less important, and I think if you read Roshin's book on Poland, for example, I couldn't write a book of 300 pages on Finland of the same type, although it came to me for a while that I should try and do that, but there's just not the sources, there's not the interest on both sides. And the other thing that betrays this is the fact that about every 5 years, there's an article in some Irish nationalist publication that is noticing this for the first time. And you still get that now also, not maybe in an explicitly nationalist thing, but people almost always, I say I've been secretary of our Gaelic football team for a long time in Helsinki, and whenever we get new blood over, usually it's because they've met a Finnish woman. Almost always that way round, and that's why I'm there as well. Like, have you noticed like all of these parallels between Finland and Ireland? And it's something we don't know until we go there and see it. And it was something the girl who I met at university, who's now my wife, chatted me up by saying, sorry, I don't know if she's watching. No, she's not watching. The first thing she ever said to me was, "We had a famine in Finland," which is a very good way of. But it set me off on this path, obviously, and I'm still there. But yeah, there are all these parallels said, but they're not known as with Finland really, and we don't find out about them by accident. And there was a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, somebody phoned me up from the Irish Times to ask about these parallels, and they wrote this article in the Irish Times where they had, you know, it was very similar to articles that had been in the Irish Times maybe once a decade since the 1850s, that this thing had just occurred to them. So yeah, so I think in answer to your question, Morris, it's that compared with Hungary, Poland, it's not well known yet. Sean?
Yeah, I was fascinating and quite incredible underground. What occurred to me listening to you is there is a missing link to Fisher's arguments, and it's when he says, "I'm a liberal, but I completely reject separatism." Because if you go back to Sexton's argument, which you quoted, Sexton is saying Finland is an example of how you can rule another people peacefully.
Yes.
And if you do it for Finland, you can do it for home rule. Or you can do it for Ireland, under home rule, that's managerial affairs. Fisher is clearly having none of that. For him, the home rule is presumably just the thin end of the wedge towards complete separation.
Yeah, possibly. I think I'm not speaking for Joseph R. Fisher, obviously, but Sexton's talking in 1885 before the split, and I wonder if at that point things seemed possible in a way that they didn't then in 1899. So they're thinking in 1855, even Sexton is thinking in 1885 that if Ireland gets home rule, it will become a loyal and contented part of the empire, I imagine. Whereas in 1899, what's happened in Finland has shown that this illusion of autonomy was always just at the gift of the Tsar and could be taken away at any time. So I think Fisher's perspective is different in that sense because of the time. And maybe by 1899, Fisher doesn't think that home rule in Ireland would be possible in the way that it might have been perceived as being possible in 1855, where both traditions, both communities would have had some kind of more or less equal say. It's become so nationalist and Catholic by 1899. This is all.
Do you have any reason to believe that he would have felt otherwise earlier?
No, I don't know much about his early life. He graduated in 76 from Galway. I don't know what sort of circus.
It's interesting to many Irish and English liberals, I suppose, in
Yeah.
the late 50s and the 60s, who would say support from the, you know, independence or a form of independence for Italy,
Yes,
or something, would draw the line at Ireland. Usually out of a
yes,
set of theories of race or innate barbarism,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
ungovernability, or
yeah.
religion, or whatever you're having yourself. You know,
Well, I mean, the Northern Whig goes over very strongly to liberal unionism in 1886.
Yeah.
But the fundamental argument is drawn from Dicey,
Right.
which is already kind of widespread by that point.
Yeah.
That home rule can never be constitutionally an end point. It must always pave the way.
so
for
I think
separation.
developing that through the 80s. It's not a starting point, is it? I mean, he writes more after parallelism and crime.
Yeah, but those are.
He said there was a possibility that liberals like himself could have engaged with it earlier, but now that we have explored the entrails of what this nationalism is,
Yeah.
we can no longer go that way. So Dicey's point is not unchanging. It is altered by circumstances, I think.
One of the reasons I think Fisher.
That's what we mean by liberal unionist, you know.
Yeah.
When you say the Whig liberal unionist position, what do we mean by liberal unionist?
Well, so there's a formal organisation, the Liberal Unionist Alliance, is established in 1886 with a branch in Belfast.
Okay, yeah, but sorry, which one ideas? Yes, I mean, I'm aware of the organisation, but we're talking about mentalities as well, aren't we? So is there a liberal, you know, it's ideas we're talking about, not institutions, though clearly they have a relationship.
Yeah, no, so this will be interesting to pursue. One reason why I think that Fisher probably hasn't been written about more is because there's no archive of his work. He didn't have diaries, as far as I can tell, and people don't seem to know much about his early life. And
So interesting, thought, yeah.
Yes.
To keep the archive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's because it was from that side.
Yeah.
There's also letters from him in the archive of Leo Mechelin, who was another one of these leading and prime minister in the end. So there are letters from him in Finland. There is, I think I wrote to the National Archives in Ireland correcting one of their online catalogue entries because there was a letter from Fisher there. Maybe in the Horace Plunkett collection, but I'll need to check. But yeah, I as far as I can tell, I've done this kind of cursory search that you can do from Finland, looking up archives and so I'm trying to find if there's a Joseph Fisher archive.
He's an old person.
Yeah.
Archive, isn't he?
Yeah. But maybe because he flitted between here and London, or I don't know. That didn't stop many people having an archive. But sorry.
It's perhaps a way of getting at Margaret's question about liberal unionism.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember if his criticisms of British government in Ireland were confined to his correspondence to Deutscher, or was he ever in English-speaking publications publicly critical of British government in Ireland, or was it only when he was corresponding to Deutscher?
No, it's good. I was just thinking, was there not one of the later ones? Sorry, now I'm thinking of this one. Yeah, it's a good question. That, as far as I can tell from my sources now, that is the case. And the problem with some of his articles in the Times is they're not attributed to him, and you're just trying to guess what's his voice. But yeah, that would be something more to have a look at. Yeah.
You know what's really interesting? Isn't he the one who writes to Mrs. Reid? She's the wife of an Ulster Unionist MP.
Right.
And he writes to her from the Boundary Commission, and she shows the letters.
Oh yes, exactly. Yes, it is him. Yes, yes, yeah.
I've only ever seen published versions of those letters.
Where are the originals?
So where are the originals?
Yeah. Who blows the whole thing up that we're gonna have a 6 county. Yeah.
I've never looked at the originals.
Yeah.
I've just seen because they're constantly reproduced, you know.
Yeah. That
is
can go,
quite interesting.
it can go on my to-do list if I do anything. Yeah. Sorry, this is the like I said, it's not even so much a work in progress as something I thought is interesting. So I'm still also finding out these things. Yeah.
That's a Kropotkin's archive.
I'd looked at Kropotkin's archive when I knew nothing about Fisher, so I'd need to go back and, as actually was the case with Reuter, that I wasn't even looking for Fisher at that stage. I was looking for letters between Reuter and an American journalist who was visiting Finland in 1902, 1903, exposing the idea that there was another famine in Finland, and that this showed Russian misgovernment, but also that the Finns were coping with it themselves. So it was another example of this idea that Finns had invited over foreign journalists. It's a guy called Louis Koch of the Christian Herald, an illustrated neuropaper in America. So I went to the archive to look for those letters, and then I realized there was all these other ones. Also Horace Plunkett's letters in Reuter's archive, because he was interested in cooperatism and so on. James?
Just coming back on this point, the letter you cited where he references various points of criticism of British.
Yes.
Actions in particular of this establishment. There been a perceptible difference in interpretation, so more conservative unionist elements with regards to Finland, as opposed to say his liberal unionist perspective.
In regards to Finland, I think both sides were just strongly anti-Russian and in favour of Finland having its old rights restored, or what they perceive to be its old rights restored. I don't know if it's controversial to say that. I should watch what the fact is that the 1809 settlement was a little bit vague. Let's just say that, and people have discussed it in general histories of Finland, what it actually meant when Finland was supposed to have its own parliament. But definitely by the end of the 19th century, it was seen as legally, acceptable that Finland had its own governance. And in 1910, there was a big international meeting about it, a legal conference where representatives of different countries agreed that Finland had the legal right to home rule. And people, Irish representatives like Jeremiah McVeigh, the MP and newspaperman, he was there involved in that. But it was nothing that was seen like in the Irish case. And in that case, I think the liberal unionist perspective and the conservative perspective are very similar. And related to that, I think then it would be interesting to see if this sort of more subtle liberal unionist perspective, which he's presenting to Reuter, would have been presented in public fora. But I've looked, not recently now, but I gave a version of this paper a year ago in Armagh, 2 years ago in Armagh, and before that I looked in the Northern Whig, and I couldn't find that much that was definitely attributable to Fisher about Finland.
Good. Okay. Do we have a question at the back?
No.
Yep. Okay. Please. You have to ask a question, not compulsory. Do you have any other questions? No? Anybody online? Sorry, Margaret, go ahead.
In what way, I think in the Republic, Finland is currently represented as brilliant educational system, great social welfare, it's all very, and phones or something, wasn't can't remember. So what kind of representation of Ireland is there in contemporary Finland?
I'm very positive, I would say. We're not British for a start, which is a good thing. Sorry, but by that the idea that Ireland is an English-speaking country which is still within the European Union and isn't like, I don't know what I can say. But like people think Britain is a basket case at the moment, and Ireland. And I think yes, and I think the Northern Ireland issue, the protocol issue, is causing a lot of trouble for me buying records, for example. Like I've had to stop buying records from shops here in Belfast because they get stopped even though they shouldn't, and I have to pay customs to get them. You know, no one knows what's going on with that, but everybody's affected by it because everybody in Finland was buying stuff online from Britain. So there are issues to do with this. There's the Tory party government. There's the economy. So almost opposite to the 19th century, Ireland is now seen as very positive because it's not it's not Britain. We're actually having an event which I'll be very sorry to miss. I'm having a seminar on the famine in Maynooth in a couple of weeks, but on the same day as that, the Irish Embassy is having an event in my university celebrating 60 years of diplomatic relations between Finland and Ireland, where I'm doing I think I'm doing an online thing. I'm very sad to not be there on my own turf. But there is this discourse of Ireland and Finland are great friends because we're not in NATO and because we've been working together with the UN and peacekeeping and we're small nations with big neighbours. There's that kind of discourse is quite strong in the diplomatic core. Of course, Finland's now joining NATO, so this is different, or it will if the Hungarians and the Turks. Yes, yeah.
You talked about the Finns being keen to internationalise their national question, particularly in Britain. And I'm just wondering, you know, when the Irish, whether it's the Home Rulers in the late 19th century or the separatists, when they internationalised the Irish question, they get a lot of very practical things, particularly in terms of America. You know, a real political power, fundraising, and so on. They're also mobilising a diaspora. Do the Finns get much when they try to internationalise the Finnish question, particularly in relation to Britain? I mean, other than sort of like maybe the warm feeling of people you admire thinking your case is moral, does it translate into any?
That's what it is, but I think to Finns that's worth more than money. That the idea that somebody else likes you across the water is very important. It is mainly moral support. And that's why I think this case is interesting, that I just mentioned in 1902-3, there's another harsh winter, famine is threatened, and it's very much intertwined with this question of Finland being oppressed by Russia and standing alone. And there you do get, as you do in 1868, during the famine that I'm currently dealing with, in 1856, the British raise money for Finland for the famine. So same in 1892, and then in 1902, then in 1917, then during the Continuation War and the Winter War in 1939 to 44, the British are raising money for these crises, but it's very much bound up in being antipathetic to the Russians or to the Soviet Union later on. But I think also the discourse of legal right being supported by international governments is really important to them in the first few years of the 20th century, more so than money. I think that isn't such a problem as in Ireland. And also the diaspora is fairly differently organised. So post 1868, there isn't a huge migration of Finns despite the famine to the New World. A lot of them go to the Russian Empire and other places. So you don't get this angry diaspora fermenting nationalism. But then in the 1890s, you do. There's basically boats start going between Sweden and Finland and the New World. So mass migration starts in the 1880s to 1890s. So by 1902, there is more Finnish citizens or Finnish-born people in America who are also sending back money and so on. And then the problem with that then is that it becomes very split along red and white lines also in the diaspora. So in 1917, 1918, you get both sides sending money back to their own people. One of the problems with international aid in 1917 is that some countries don't want to support Finland because they worry that the money will go to the Reds, and some people won't support Finland because they're worried that the Whites will give it to Germany. So international aid tonight during the famine in the Civil War is very complicated. I feel like I've gone far away now from the original question. No, I think that the patterns are very different. Yeah, it's a very good observation. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we might wrap up there for this afternoon. So thank you very much, Andy, for coming all the way. I was going to say all the way from Jyväskylä, but all the way from Maynooth today.
No, I came from Ballina.
All the way from Ballina.
On bus.
It's great to have you here. This is an important element of comparative history, which you very clearly and fascinatingly explained for us today. So thank you very much for that. We're looking forward, as I said before, to the book on the Great Finnish Famine coming out, and to thinking further about comparative history of Ireland and Finland in that period as well. So can we finish by thanking Andy in the usual way of a round of applause?
Oh, that is okay. Amanda. So that was going to be the usual way. And thanks for people watching online as well. If there were
a few.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.